We all know the story of regret. I think it's one of the things that we're afraid is going to happen when we start simplifying our homes. The problem is that regret typically happens when we've now placed a higher value on it than we did when it was in our possession. And that's a problem, friends, hopefully one that we can solve today. Well, hello friend, I'm Mary Beth with At What Cost, where simple living and deep faith go hand in hand. And this problem of value and regret can really trip us up when we start to simplify our home. Do we keep this? Do we not keep it? It can be downright maddening to make decisions about what stays and what goes. So first things first, let's define it, because sometimes we think we know what words mean, but it just gets a little foggy over time. So the definition of regret is to feel sad, repentant, or disappointed over something that has happened or been done, especially a loss or a missed opportunity. Which kind of reminds me of some things I experienced when we recently went to the Ark Encounter over our summer vacation. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, I would argue that it comes down really to two main reasons that we've found ourselves experiencing this regret over decluttering. The first is that we didn't take care in decluttering our items the first go round. Now, if that stings just a little, I know, stick with me here. I certainly am guilty of a few of these things that we're going to talk about. So the first is the idea of peer pressure. So maybe you're decluttering with a friend or a group of people, and everybody is getting rid of their Instant Pot because the air fryer is where it's at now, right? We hear about this all the time. Instant Pots were all the rage, and then I don't know, the air fryer just kind of came along in all of its chicken nugget tater tot goodness, and we don't use our Instant Pots as much anymore. So out it goes. Unfortunately, you actually do enjoy making a lot of soups or shredding chicken or some of those other things that you do occasionally use your Instant Pot for, but you've gotten rid of it now and it's winter and there's no taco soup. Well, friends, now we have room for regret. Or if you're like me, maybe you're just so overwhelmed with your stuff that you decide you need to get rid of all of it. You want it out at all costs, and you have run into this kind of scenario of ready, fire, aim. Yeah, it's a problem, friends, and it happens to all of us. We get a little ahead of ourselves and kind of rush to judgment in this state of overwhelm. Now, that's just two examples. I would agree that there are a lot of other reasons that we can sometimes not take care in decluttering our items. And you know what, friends? It's going to be okay. The other main reason I think we sometimes can fall into regret is a little something I like to call wilderness syndrome. And yes, it's a thing. I just made it up right now. And we're going to roll with it. Now, I want you to put on your Old Testament hat and go all the way back to Exodus. I want you to think about the Hebrew people. Now, they had been enslaved in Egypt, and conditions there were pretty miserable. But as they are out in the wilderness, they're starting to grumble because conditions there aren't exactly favorable. And they fall into this trap of saying things like, well, at least when we were in Egypt, we had meat. And that's the problem with looking back at things and these rose-colored glasses that we sometimes can find ourselves looking through. We either look back on situations as being worse than they were, or sometimes we look back on things as being better than they were, rather than actually reminiscing about things the way they truly were. We tend to hone in on the highlight reels of life and don't always see the complete picture when we look back in the past. So we declutter items and maybe things aren't going our way at the moment, and it's easy for us to look back and say, wow, life sure was easier when I had that Instant Pot. Even though you maybe only used it 3 or 4 times and now you exclusively use your air fryer. Side note, friends, I'm not loving either one of them lately, but that's a tale for another day. So how do we live a life without regrets? Or at least decluttering regrets, because I can't promise that this is going to solve everything else in life for you. I can say that I have learned a few things about decluttering and regrets over the last 2 years that I think could benefit you in this area. I was recently watching a video from Dave Ramsey, and he talked about this issue of financial security and success being another 80-20 rule. So it's 80% practiced mindset, motivation, and 20% actual knowledge. I think we can apply the same kind of principle to this living our life without regret. The first part of this is all mindset. So how do we get our head right when it comes to living a life without regret? The first is that we have to stop looking at this idea of living a life of no regrets as a bad thing. Sometimes I think it can get a bad rap, that you're impulsive, that you are reckless, that you don't care about the outcome or other people or how you impact them, because after all, you're living on the edge and you have a life of no regrets. No. That's not the case. That's not really how things actually work when it comes to regrets. That's just recklessness, and we don't want to do that either. We also have to stop looking at a life without regrets as being cold-hearted or unsentimental. Passing things along doesn't make you cold-hearted or any less sentimental than you feel like you are. And you certainly are not devaluing or disrespecting the people who have come before you, important people in your past, by not hanging on to some of those things that are tripping you up. Someone once mentioned to me that people want to leave things to us so that they can be remembered. They want to know that people also recognize that they had a place in life. Now, friends, I believe that it is essential for us to have sentimental items, things that remind us of the past. If we didn't have all of the Old Testament, we would have a really hard time understanding the New Testament. So I definitely see value in hanging on to some of these things that help us to remember traditions and people. But if the only things that we remember about those people are the items that we have in our home now that burden us and don't actually bring about good memories of those individuals, that's not something we actually want to keep in our home. We're not actually remembering that person in a way that's honoring. And I don't know anybody who would want to be remembered as a burden. Rather than worrying about other people having enough stuff of yours to remember you by, be intentional in your relationships with them and give them something to remember. Now, I have my grandmother's cookbook, and let me tell you, friends, I make like 2 recipes out of that cookbook, but it stirs up a lot of memories of times when she would cook Christmas dinner and we would go to their house and play with my cousins, and there was always this wonderful aroma of something that she was cooking in the kitchen. And yes, that cookbook does stir up some things like that for me, but that doesn't mean that I have to hang on to all of her kitchen utensils and half of her bakeware in order for me to have that mark left where she was in my life. There's always a part of her that I will take with me. I don't have to regret getting rid of some of those things because I think that she would be upset with me. Living a life without decluttering regret means that we allow ourselves to grieve some of this process, and this is the important part, and embrace the freedom of letting go of things that are holding us back. Everything that happens in our lives is an opportunity for us to either draw nearer to Christ or be pushed further away. Rather than dwelling in a place of regret over things that we've parted, we could totally embrace this as just a walk and exercise in our sanctification. Because after all, none of these things secure our salvation or separate us from it. It's already done, and all of this, again, is just either pushing us closer to Christ or further away. Now let's talk about that other 20% because I think this is just as important as the mindset. So the first is that we really want to take care in decluttering, right? Because we've realized that's one of the reasons that we ended up with regret to begin with. What does that actually look like? Well, it looks a lot like taking your time, which I know can be kind of frustrating for those of us who are kind of all in kind of people. Take your time when it comes to decluttering, whether it's one bin, one cabinet, a 15-minute session. There's no need to rush through decluttering. And let me tell you, friends, there's no extra credit for finishing early. It's okay to temporarily hang on to things that you're uncertain about. Just don't live in that place permanently, but temporarily, while you're making a determination about whether or not you actually need this item, it's okay to hang on to it for a little while. We just don't want to live there permanently because, well, to be honest, that's kind of where we're at right now, right? Like we're a little bit miserable with all of our stuff hanging around all of the time. But there are things that we may have to really think on before we part ways with it. And it's okay to hang on to some of that stuff for a little while. And kind of the opposite is true. If you're uncertain about things, it's okay to part with those things too. Not everything that we declutter is a life or death situation, even though it may feel like that sometimes. And don't get me wrong, there are some times when we have really important items that we need to keep track of. Unfortunately, they can sometimes get lost in all of the rest of the mess too. But if you have an item that you're uncertain about, it is okay for you to pass some of those things along. Like, do you need 3 whisks? Probably not, but you might. Can you replace it for less than $1? Yeah, probably. So feel free to part with it. What about books that you've already read? Do you need those? Probably not, but maybe. I mean, what if they're first edition, signed by the author specifically for you, and they sit on your shelf nice, you enjoy looking at them, and they stir up good and positive memories for you? Well, then you may want to hang on to them, but you may also want to part with some of the other ones. And it's okay. If you're uncertain about whether or not you should keep it, it's okay for you to part with it, and it's okay for you to keep it. You'll know when the time is right for you to be able to pass those items along. But again, we can't live in this uncertainty with everything. Side note, you probably can live without a whisk altogether, and it will be okay. Now, the next way to really take care when it comes to decluttering is to stop turning yourself into a little decluttering Pharisee. There's no need to create a bunch of decluttering rules that actually make it more difficult for you to complete the decluttering process in your home. In some of these things, you are just going to have to, again, fall back into faith and knowing that God is going to lead you in this process and walk through this decluttering process with you, which kind of reminds me of some things I experienced when we recently went to the Ark Encounter over our summer vacation. I was looking at the care that was placed in every last detail of the ark, and I started thinking about our homes. If we were going to leave our homes knowing that not one iota would be left if we were even ever given the opportunity to come back to our homes, what would we actually take? This story of Noah is an interesting one, and one that I have kind of gotten hung up on over the years, especially when it comes to Genesis 6:6. So in chapter 6, we have the beginning of the flood story where the world has become completely and utterly corrupt with the exception of this righteous man, Noah. And in verse 6, we see that God regrets his creation. And that can be a little bit of a difficult verse to deal with. It certainly has tripped me up. It can cause some confusion when we think about the characteristic of God that we call immutability, so his unchangingness. God is constant. He never changes. He's always the same. And we see that riddled throughout the scripture, that we have these declarations of the immutability of God. And that is a good thing for us, friends. He is sovereign. He knows everything that's going to happen, and he is in control of all of it. He's not some wishy-washy God up in heaven looking down on creation in the direction that it's going, wringing his hands out, wishing that he had never created this creation in the first place. That's not the kind of God that we see here. That's the idea that we get when we look at things through our very limited scope of mind. And let me tell you, friends, in comparison with God's scope of knowledge, our scope of knowledge is like real small. God knew exactly what was wrong, and he knew exactly how he would fix it. And then he takes action. This act of regretting that we see here is really more akin to grief. God is grieving over the corruption of this creation that he's made. He's grieving in disappointment and sadness over their missed opportunity to glorify him. But it's not outside of his control. Now, before we go down the path of sovereignty and man's free will, we are going to save that for another time. For now, let's pause and dwell on the overarching theme that we see here in the flood. So we have God, he recognizes that there's a problem, he preserves what is good, he makes provision for it, and he does away with the rest. So what does that have to do with Noah and decluttering? Well, in the process of this, Noah has a safe haven, one that is carefully thought out and curated, one that would sustain Noah and his family as they depended on and waited on the Lord's will to come to fruition. Noah was not alone. God was with him through all of this. Now, doesn't that sound like the kind of place we would want to curate our homes to be? A safe haven that has everything that we need as we depend on and wait on the Lord. If you have found yourself in a decluttering rut and you need a little motivation, you can click the playlist right up here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.